Imagine waking up on a battlefield where the air itself feels like it's trying to kill you. The heat is blinding, the sand burns like fire, and somewhere beyond the shimmering horizon, an army 3 times your size is waiting to erase you from history. This was the world Richard the Lionheart marched into. A 12-mile-long column of exhausted crusaders trapped between the sea and Saladin's unstoppable forces. Every step south felt like walking deeper into a grave already prepared for them. Yet from this impossible situation emerged one of the most shocking battlefield turnarounds ever recorded, a moment so fast, so brutal, so mathematically unlikely that historians still struggle to explain how it happened. Because when the breaking point finally came, it lasted just 17 minutes. If you love deep-dive historical documentaries, you're in the right place. Make sure to like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, where in the world are you watching from? Your support helps the channel grow and lets us bring you even more epic stories. From history's forgotten corners, the march began long before sunrise, when the shoreline was still swallowed in darkness and the only sound came from the slow, labored breathing of men already exhausted before the day had even begun. Richard the Lionheart was leading more than an army. He was leading a column of human endurance stretched to its breaking point. Picture the geography. To the left, the endless Mediterranean, glittering and indifferent. To the right, an unforgiving wilderness crawling with enemy scouts. The narrow strip of land between them was both a road and a trap. A corridor that funneled 20,000 crusaders southward toward Jaffa with no room to maneuver, no space to retreat, and no margin for error. By mid-morning, the heat turned the world into an oven. Knights cooked inside their armor as if sealed in iron coffins. Horses collapsed every few minutes, forcing their riders to carry shields, lances, and chainmail on foot through sand so hot it scorched through leather boots. Some men fainted and never woke. Others staggered onward in silence, too dehydrated to curse their fate. Yet the march wasn't just physically punishing, it was psychologically suffocating. Everyone knew what lurked just beyond the dunes and hills. Saladin's shadow army, 30,000 strong, moving in parallel like wolves stalking a wounded stag. Crusader scouts returned with the same message again and again. The enemy was getting closer, tightening their grip. Some soldiers crossed themselves every few minutes. Others muttered prayers or stared at the shimmering horizon, as if hoping the heat mirage might suddenly reveal an escape that did not exist. What made this march so terrifying wasn't only the imbalance of numbers, nor the relentless heat, nor even the memory of the catastrophic defeat at Hattin 4 years earlier. It was the knowledge that Richard had willingly chosen to risk everything here, on this narrow coastal road, where one mistake meant extinction. Medieval commanders avoided bottlenecks like this at all costs, but Richard had no alternative. Behind the Crusaders lay a coastline ruined by Saladin's scorched earth tactics. Ahead lay Jaffa, the only port capable of sustaining a long campaign. Without it, the entire Third Crusade would wither and die. So the army pushed on, mile after tortured mile, stretched so thin that messages took 2 hours to travel from front to rear. Imagine the dread of marching in the middle of a column that long, knowing that if the enemy struck the center, the wings might not even hear your screams, until it was far too late. And still the psychological warfare intensified. At night, Muslim war drums rolled across the hills like thunder. Signal fires appeared and vanished like ghostly stars. By day, swirling dust clouds teased the Crusaders with visions of approaching cavalry. Richard rode near the center banner, pale with heat exhaustion, silently calculating distance, timing, and the probability of survival. The men didn't know it yet, but every step they took was pulling them deeper into a trap that had been engineered with terrifying precision. Yet it was also setting the stage for a reversal so dramatic, so brutally fast, that it would leave chroniclers struggling to describe it for centuries. A moment when desperation, discipline, and timing collided in a way that defied all military logic. This march into the impossible was not just the beginning of a battle. It was the tightening of a bowstring that, when released, would unleash one of the most astonishing 17 minutes in the history of warfare. From the moment the Crusaders left Acre, Saladin had been shaping the battlefield like a master craftsman carving a sculpture from stone. He knew the coastal road was Richard's only viable route to Jaffa, and rather than block it outright, he allowed the Crusaders to advance slowly, painfully, while his forces tightened around them like a noose. Every day, Muslim scouts rode parallel to the Christian column, staying just out of bowshot, but always visible enough to remind the Crusaders that they were prey being herded toward a killing ground. Saladin's generals coordinated their movements with signal fires that flared across the hills at dusk, a haunting constellation of lights that told the Crusaders everything they needed to know. The enemy was organized, watching, and perfectly synchronized. By contrast, Richard's army stretched so thin that half the men couldn't see the other half. It was a formation tailor-made for disaster, and Saladin intended to exploit every inch of its vulnerability. His psychological warfare was as precise as his military planning. At dawn, the beat of war drums echoed through the dunes. At night, riders blew horns that carried for miles in the still desert air. None of these actions caused casualties, but they drained morale, frayed discipline, and sharpened the fear that each sunrise might be their last. Saladin wasn't rushing toward a decisive clash. He was preparing the mental battlefield long before swords would cross. Yet while the Crusaders suffered through heat and exhaustion, Saladin's massive host moved with purpose and efficiency across the interior high ground. Nearly 30,000 warriors, Turkish horse archers, Kurdish heavy cavalry, Mamluk elites, and infantry flying the black banners of jihad maneuvered into a vast crescent formation that would eventually unfurl across the plains near Arsuf. The design was mathematically elegant, archers on the wings to harass and disrupt, heavy cavalry poised to exploit any fracture, infantry ready to press into gaps created by the first two. Saladin intended to do more than defeat Richard. He aimed to crush the Crusader army so completely that Christian power in the Holy Land would collapse in a single morning. His chosen battlefield ensured this. The Crusaders would be forced to march in column along open ground, exposed on their inland flank, while the Muslim army attacked from high ground with full mobility. There would be no forests to break cavalry charges, no hills for defensive advantage, no fortifications to retreat behind. On paper, it was perfection, the kind of strategic setup generals dream of, but rarely achieve. And when Saladin's scouts reported that the Crusaders were only hours away from entering this trap, the entire Muslim host prepared to strike. Their banners rose like a dark tide. Their formation shifted into a perfect killing arc. And as dawn approached on September 7, 1191, Saladin knew he had engineered the ideal moment. Richard was cornered, overheated, stretched thin, and almost out of options. The trap had closed. Now all that remained was the slaughter. By the time the Crusader column reached the plains north of Arsuf, exhaustion wasn't just a weakness. It was an enemy more relentless than any army Saladin could field. The heat had become a living thing, pressing onto the men like an invisible weight, suffocating and unforgiving. Armor burned against skin. Leather straps peeled away in the sun. Horses, already starved of water, stumbled in the sand and fell with a sickening finality that sent ripples of dread through nearby ranks. Every time a horse collapsed, the knight riding it lost not only mobility, but identity. A mounted warrior forced to fight on foot was almost as vulnerable as a common soldier. Richard's army was shrinking in strength long before a single enemy arrow was fired. Water was scarce and often poisoned by Muslim raiders who moved ahead of the march, leaving only brackish wells that sickened the men. Some soldiers retched uncontrollably after drinking. Others couldn't force a sip past their cracked lips. Even the sea mocked them, so close you could touch it, yet useless for drinking. Men muttered in frustration that they would die in full sight of water they couldn't consume. The psychological pressure was unbearable everywhere. They felt watched, hunted, measured, and all the while, the distant silhouette of Saladin's shadow army crept closer, tightening the coils around the Crusader line. Scouts returned with increasingly grim reports, enemy cavalry tracking their flank, horse archers circling at impossible range, and infantry units appearing and disappearing behind low ridges. It was like trying to march through a landscape haunted by phantoms. You never saw more than a fraction of the enemy, yet you felt their presence constantly. Richard himself rode near the center, swaying from fever and dysentery, barely able to stay on his horse. But even in that state, he understood the cruel mathematics of the moment. If the column broke at any point, if panic took hold, or if Saladin struck the center when communication lines were stretched thin, the army would die in scattered fragments along the coast. No reinforcements, no escape, no redemption. The men sensed this too. Some whispered about Hattin, the nightmare battle where a Crusader army even larger than this one had been annihilated by Saladin's forces, and the true cross itself was lost. Others clutched relics, prayed beneath their breaths, or stared blankly ahead, not at the road but through it, as if hoping the next few miles might pass as quickly as a bad dream. They didn't know it yet, but the worst was still ahead. This march, this agony, this slow unraveling of physical and mental strength, it was merely the prelude. The breaking point was coming, and when it arrived, it would explode with a force that reshaped the entire course of the crusade. When the sun finally broke over the plains near Arsuf, the Crusaders saw a sight so vast, so meticulously arranged, that many would later claim it looked less like an army and more like a vision of the last. Judgment itself. Out of the morning haze emerged Saladin's crescent, a sweeping arc of cavalry, archers, and infantry stretching more than 2 miles across the landscape. Their polished weapons caught the early light, turning the formation into a moving wall of fire and steel. At the high ground on the Muslim right stood Taqi al-Din and his 10,000 Kurdish cavalry, hardened veterans who had shattered Christian armies for years. In the center, beneath the Sultan's own banner, waited 8,000 Mamluks, elite soldiers trained from childhood for absolute discipline and unbreakable combat. And on the left, spread across the flat plains like a living tide, were 7,000 Turkish horse archers, masters of mobility whose composite bows could punch through mail armor at astonishing distances. Behind them, 5,000 infantry stood ready, many bearing black banners of jihad, eager for a decisive blow that would secure their place in history. It was a formation engineered not just to defeat Richard, but to annihilate him. Saladin had committed everything. No reserves, no holding back. This was meant to be the day the Crusaders were wiped from the Holy Land forever. For the Crusaders trapped in the narrow coastal corridor, the impact of this sight was immediate and visceral. Horses shivered beneath their riders. Men gripped shields with trembling fingers. The drums began first, a thunderous, rhythmic pounding that rolled across the plains like the heartbeat of some massive creature awakening for battle. Then the horns joined in, wailing across the sky with a high, airy pitch that seemed designed to crawl under the skin and settle directly in the spine. The noise alone felt like an attack, but it was the precision of the formation that truly unnerved Richard's men. Saladin wasn't improvising. He wasn't reacting. He was executing a plan perfected long before the Crusaders ever set foot on the plains. Every unit moved with a coordination that made the army seem almost mechanical. Archers riding in widening circles, cavalry tightening into charging lanes, commanders scanning the Crusader line with unnerving patience. This was the moment Saladin had engineered through weeks of shadowing, harassing, and psychological warfare. A moment when the Crusader column was overheated, overstressed, overstretched, and utterly vulnerable. Yet if Saladin believed the sight alone would shatter them, he underestimated the discipline Richard had drilled into his army. Instead of rushing forward in fear or anger, the Crusaders closed ranks, shields overlapping, spears angled outward, waiting for the impact they knew was coming. They looked like a battered wall on the edge of collapse. But Richard saw something else. The perfect conditions for a counterstroke he had been calculating since dawn. What neither army knew was that this carefully arranged crescent, this flawless masterpiece of battlefield geometry, was minutes away from unraveling in one of the most unexpected reversals in medieval warfare. The first arrows fell almost gently, like a breeze carrying dust across the plains. But within moments, the sky darkened as thousands of Turkish horse archers unleashed a storm so dense it seemed to dim the sunlight itself. Arrows hissed through the air in an unbroken cascade, 20,000, then 30,000 per minute. A deadly rain engineered to break the Crusaders long before the cavalry reached them. Shields shuddered under the impact. Spears quivered where they were planted in the sand. Horses screamed as arrows pierced muscle and armor, collapsing beneath riders who had no time to mourn them. The Crusader formation bristled with shafts, like a hedgehog defending itself. Yet the men inside could barely breathe under the weight of fear and discipline. Every instinct told them to charge, to break free, to strike back at the taunting horsemen who darted just out of reach. But Richard's command was absolute. Hold the line. So they endured. The thunder of hooves circled them in a growing spiral, the horse archers firing on the move, turning the battlefield into a giant rotating death wheel. The constant motion made the attackers impossible to pin down, and the psychological strain of facing enemies you could not reach or silence pushed the Crusaders toward panic. Each rotation tightened like a noose, and with every pass, more arrows found their mark. Smoke, sand, dust, and the iron tang of blood blended into a suffocating haze that blurred the horizon. To the Crusaders, it felt less like a battle and more like drowning, not in water, but in steel. Then came the probing attacks. Small contingents of Kurdish cavalry surged forward in sudden bursts, charging the Crusader line at full speed before wheeling away at the last possible moment, denying the infantry any chance to retaliate. Again and again they came, 200 riders, then 300, then 500, each assault timed to exploit any twitch, any stagger, any break in discipline. The rear guard suffered the worst of it, especially the Knights Hospitaller, who absorbed the brunt of the pressure. Their horses fell one by one, turning the rear formation into a shrinking pocket of men forced to fight on foot. Under relentless bombardment, sweat burned their eyes. Armor felt like molten metal. Some knights dropped to their knees from heat and exhaustion only to drag themselves upright. Because falling meant dying, messengers galloped to Richard again and again with the same desperate plea. We cannot hold much longer. Allow us to charge. And each time, Richard's answer came back sharp and unshaken. Not yet. His restraint baffled his commanders, infuriated the Hospitallers, and nearly broke the men under siege. But Richard knew something they did not. The Muslim formation, elegant and deadly at range, was fragile up close. He needed the enemy to commit just a little more, to push just a little tighter, to expose the weakness he had been waiting to exploit. What the Crusaders saw as torture was, in Richard's mind, precision timing. But that timing was seconds from collapsing under human limits, because deep in the rear guard, among the battered Hospitallers gasping for air beneath a rain of arrows, a spark of defiance was about to ignite the moment that would change the battle and Saladin's entire strategy forever. 4 hours. The Hospitallers had been absorbing punishment no army in the medieval world was designed to withstand. Arrow after arrow slammed into their shields, their helmets, their horses, a ceaseless barrage that turned every breath into a battle of willpower. Men staggered beneath the weight of exhaustion. Some could barely lift their shields high enough to block the next volley. The ground beneath them was littered with dying horses, shattered lances, and the bodies of brothers they had fought beside for years. By late morning, their ranks were a shadow of what they had been. Of the original mounted knights in the rear guard, fewer than half remained with functioning horses. The rest fought on foot, hauling armor that felt heavier with every minute under the sun. Their commander, Marshal Gerard de Ridderfort, watched in agony as his men suffered a slow death, not in glorious combat, but in restraint. Again and again, messengers begged Richard for permission to charge, to break free of the suffocating defensive posture. And each time, the answer cut through hope like a blade. Hold to Richard. Discipline was the only thing keeping the Crusader army alive. But to the Hospitallers, discipline was killing them. Their pride, their training, their very identity as mounted warriors burned hotter than the sun beating down on their helmets. It was only a matter of time before a single spark found dry enough tinder to ignite a firestorm. That spark came in the form of a furious, heartbreaking moment. A breaking point no commander could fully predict or control. Brother Baldwin of Carin, a Hospitaller knight who had watched too many comrades fall without striking back, finally snapped. Sources differ on his exact words, but one chronicle claims he shouted something like, "God wills not that we die like cattle," before lowering his lance and spurring his horse straight into the mass of Kurdish cavalry in front of him. For a heartbeat, the world froze. Then everything shattered at once. Baldwin's lone charge triggered an emotional eruption among the Hospitallers who, moments earlier, were clinging to discipline by the thinnest thread. One knight broke formation, then another, then a dozen, until the entire Hospitaller contingent surged forward in a thunderous, unplanned charge. 300 knights, driven by desperation and fury, hurled themselves into Saladin's right wing with a force no commander on either side had anticipated. To military theorists, it should have been suicide, a small, unsupported cavalry charge slamming into 10,000 seasoned Muslim horsemen. But instead of being crushed, the Hospitallers punched through the front ranks like an iron wedge tearing cloth. The Kurdish cavalry recoiled, shocked by the sudden ferocity. Their formation, spread thin for harassment tactics, couldn't absorb the impact. Saladin's perfect crescent bent under the pressure, then buckled. In that moment, Richard understood exactly what had happened. The opening he had been waiting for had appeared, not through strategy, but through human breaking. Now the question was whether he would join the Hospitallers or let them die alone. His answer, the decision he made in the next few seconds, would unleash one of the most astonishing reversals in medieval battlefield history. For a heartbeat, Richard the Lionheart sat frozen in the saddle, watching the impossible unfold before his eyes. The Hospitallers, the very knights he had begged to hold formation, were now thundering across the plains in a furious, uncoordinated charge that should have ended in their annihilation. Yet instead of being swallowed by Saladin's right wing, they were tearing it apart. Kurdish cavalry recoiled in disbelief, their carefully spaced formation collapsing under the sudden weight of armored knights, crashing into their ranks like a living battering ram. Dust exploded into the air as horsemen scattered, shouts of confusion replacing the rhythmic precision that had defined the Muslim advance. Richard had mere seconds to interpret what he saw, and what he saw was opportunity. A fracture in Saladin's perfect crescent, a moment of panic spreading faster than the Sultan's commanders could contain it. His entire strategy had been built on patience, on timing, on forcing the enemy to commit before unleashing the counterstrike he had so carefully envisioned. Now, that moment had arrived, not through his command, but through human desperation. If he hesitated, the Hospitallers would be cut down alone. If he charged too soon, the Crusader formation could dissolve into chaos. But if he chose correctly, he might shatter the largest Muslim army assembled since the fall of Jerusalem. The battlefield held its breath. Then Richard raised his war horn. 3 blasts split the air, a signal every knight had drilled for, a command burned into muscle and memory. Immediately, controlled chaos transformed into orchestrated fury. The Crusader line opened deliberate gaps, allowing their mounted knights to surge forward in wedge formations designed not for intimidation, but for penetration. Richard led the central wedge himself, his banner snapping violently in the wind as thousands of hooves thundered behind him. The impact was apocalyptic. The Crusader charge slammed into the Mamluk center like a hammer striking glass. Shields splintered, lances snapped, horses collided so violently that men were thrown skyward. For the first time in years, Saladin's elite infantry faced a full-speed European cavalry charge. Not scattered, not desperate, but perfectly timed and devastatingly unified. The Mamluks, famed for discipline and ferocity, found themselves overwhelmed by a momentum they could neither halt nor absorb. Meanwhile, on the Muslim left, the Templars struck the Turkish horse archers just as they were repositioning, catching them in a chaotic pivot where their bows were useless and their formation exposed. What followed was slaughter. Light armor crumpled beneath heavy blades, and the very warriors who had harassed the Crusaders for hours now fled in disarray. The crescent, the masterpiece Saladin had built, folded in on itself. Dust filled the sky. War cries drowned out drums. And somewhere amidst the chaos, Richard fought like a man possessed, carving a path through enemy ranks, his sword rising and falling with relentless precision. In just minutes, Saladin's army was not simply losing, it was unraveling. What had begun as a desperate act of defiance by a handful of knights had now transformed into the most explosive 17 minutes of shock warfare the medieval world had ever witnessed. What followed in the next few minutes was not a retreat, nor even a rout. It was a psychological implosion. Saladin's army, so meticulously arranged at dawn, began to crumble in ways no commander could have foreseen. The Kurdish cavalry on the right wing, already shaken by the Hospitallers' unexpected charge, now saw thousands of Crusader knights flooding into their broken lines. Panic spread like wildfire. These were men who had conquered Jerusalem, Damascus, and Cairo, warriors who had known only victory for years, yet they fled in complete disorder, abandoning lances, shields, and even their banners. In the center, the Mamluks fought with heroic discipline. But Richard's wedge formation punched through them with too much force, too much mass, too much momentum. Their line buckled, then split, then vanished under the pressure of metal and muscle. Dust clouds exploded upward as Crusader knights drove deeper, carving the formation apart like a blade slicing through parchment. The sound was unlike anything the chroniclers had ever described. Not the clash of duelists, but the roar of two worlds colliding. Even more devastating was the collapse of the left flank. The Turkish horse archers, deadly at distance but helpless in close combat, were caught mid-maneuver by the Templars. Their bows, so effective minutes earlier, offered no protection against heavy swords designed to crush through mail and bone. Within moments, entire ranks dissolved. Some threw down their weapons and fled toward the hills. Others tried to regroup, but found themselves swallowed by the Crusader advance. Saladin watched all of this unfold from his command hill, watched his perfect crescent disintegrate, watched seasoned veterans run from an enemy they had encircled, watched his army turn into a river of broken fragments flowing in all directions. And then came the moment that nearly ended the Third Crusade in a single stroke. Richard himself, blood streaking across his arms and armor, caught sight of Saladin's personal banner fluttering in the chaos less than 200 yards away. For a few terrifying seconds, the English king spurred his horse directly toward the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. If Richard captured or killed him, the entire Muslim defense of the Holy Land would collapse overnight. Saladin's bodyguards hurled themselves into the path of the charging king, and a brief but ferocious struggle erupted, lances splintering, men tumbling from saddles, horses rearing and screaming. Twice Richard's lance struck home, but weight of numbers forced him to wheel away before he was surrounded. Still, the psychological damage was irreversible. The Sultan, the symbol of unity, discipline, and victory, had come within moments of death. Word of this near catastrophe rippled across the battlefield faster than any messenger could ride. What discipline remained among Saladin's troops evaporated. Thousands fled toward the hills. Commanders abandoned posts. Entire units vanished into the dust. By noon, more than 7,000 of Saladin's warriors lay dead across the coastal plain, and the once invincible Muslim army had been reduced to fewer than 8,000 effective fighters. The Crusaders, who had spent the morning convinced they were marching to their deaths, now stood triumphant over one of the most dramatic collapses in medieval military history. Yet even as victory roared around him, Richard made a decision that stunned his commanders. He raised his banner and signaled a halt. The pursuit stopped. The fleeing enemy escaped. The greatest tactical victory of his life, of the entire crusade, was now complete, but its strategic consequences were not. The army had collapsed, yes, but Saladin himself still lived. As the dust began to settle over the corpse-strewn plains of Arsuf, the Crusaders found themselves standing in the aftermath of a victory so complete, so efficient, that it felt almost unreal. Fewer than 700 Crusaders had fallen. In contrast, more than 7,000 of Saladin's warriors lay dead, their bodies forming a dark red mosaic across 2 miles of scorched earth. It was the kind of outcome medieval commanders didn't just hope for, they fantasized about it. Richard's knights were exhilarated, battered, thirsty, but alive. More importantly, the army that had haunted Europe for years, the army that had crushed the Crusaders at Hattin and swept through the Holy Land like a storm, had been shattered in just 17 minutes. Men began shouting for pursuit. Commanders pleaded to finish the job and hunt down the fleeing remnants. If Richard pursued now, they argued they could end Saladin's military power forever. But Richard knew better than anyone what his army had endured. Their horses were blown. Their knights were dehydrated and bleeding, and scattered across the battlefield lay a treasure, greater than many European kingdoms' annual income, Saladin's baggage train, intact and overflowing with gold, supplies, and provisions the Crusaders desperately needed. To abandon it in pursuit of a desperate enemy fleeing into difficult terrain was to risk losing everything they had just won. So Richard lifted his banner and issued the command no one expected to hear. Halt! At that moment, triumph turned to tension. Cheers died in men's throats. The Crusaders watched as Saladin's battered survivors vanished into the hills, taking with them the very thing Richard needed most: the ability to besiege Jerusalem without fear of a counterattack. The victory had been perfect, yes, but it had not been decisive. And this is where the story of Arsuf becomes something far more tragic than triumphant. By choosing caution over pursuit, Richard secured his army for the short term, but doomed the crusade in the long run. Saladin regrouped astonishingly fast. Within days, the survivors of Arsuf were reinforced by fresh troops from Egypt and Syria, restoring the Sultan's ability to wage war. Worse, Saladin learned the harshest lesson of all: never again face Richard the Lionheart in open battle. From that moment forward, he refused to offer decisive engagements. Instead, he adopted the strategy that would slowly suffocate the Crusaders: hit-and-run raids, scorched earth tactics, intercepted supply lines, psychological warfare, anything to avoid the catastrophic force of a full Crusader charge. Richard, who had mastered the art of battlefield timing, now faced an enemy who simply refused to cooperate. Jerusalem remained tantalizingly close, just 40 miles inland, but impossible to reach without risking starvation or encirclement. Some Crusader leaders begged him to march on the city anyway, but Richard knew the brutal math. He could reach Jerusalem, perhaps even storm its walls, but he couldn't hold it. Without a permanent supply line from the coast, the Holy City would become a trap just as deadly as the road to Arsuf had been. And so, despite the greatest tactical victory of the Crusade, the Crusaders never reclaimed Jerusalem. Arsuf became a symbol of one man's brilliance and the Crusade's ultimate futility. Richard had proven he could destroy Saladin's armies. He had proven he could outthink, outfight, and outmaneuver one of history's greatest commanders. But a tactical masterpiece is not the same as a strategic victory. Arsuf won the day, but lost the war. And in the silence that followed the cheers, every knight understood the cruel truth. Their greatest triumph had brought them no closer to the holy city they had come to reclaim. In the months and years that followed, the Battle of Arsuf transformed from a desperate clash on a blistering September day into a legend studied in courts, military academies, and chronicles across continents. Richard's perfectly timed countercharge, that explosive 17-minute reversal, became the gold standard for medieval combined arms warfare. European commanders dissected every detail: the disciplined infantry stream, the controlled release of cavalry wedges, the iron patience that held the line under hours of arrow fire. From these observations, new doctrines were born: Swiss pike squares, the shock formations that would dominate European warfare for 3 centuries, traced their lineage directly to the crucible of Arsuf. Even later cavalry charges, French, Hungarian, Burgundian, borrowed Richard's emphasis on timing over brute force. Meanwhile, in the Islamic world, the battle reshaped military thinking in the opposite direction. Saladin's commanders realized that heavy Western cavalry, when properly deployed, was nearly unstoppable in direct confrontation. Thus began a shift toward mobility, defensive positioning, and attrition strategies, tactics designed not to defeat armored knights in open battle, but to avoid them altogether. In this way, the echoes of Arsuf reverberated far beyond the Holy Land, altering the trajectory of warfare through the entire medieval and early Renaissance eras. And yet, beneath all this innovation and study, a deeper irony lingered. Richard's masterpiece was both a triumph of tactical genius and a monument to strategic restraint. For while the battlefield techniques of Arsuf endured, so too did the consequences of Richard's fateful decision to halt pursuit. Saladin survived, his armies rebuilt, and Jerusalem remained under Muslim control for the next 7 centuries. When British forces finally entered the Holy City in 1917, some officers carried maps derived from reconnaissance notes taken during Richard's own surveys, a haunting reminder that his campaign had never truly ended in the way he intended. The victory at Arsuf, dazzling though it was, had consumed irreplaceable Crusader resources, trained knights, horses, supplies, morale. Each fallen knight represented years of preparation, wealth, and experience, losses the Crusader states could never replenish. As quickly as Saladin could recover his manpower from the vast populations of Egypt and Syria. And so the battle became a study in contrast, the most flawless tactical victory of the Crusades, paired with the strategic limitations that doomed their larger mission. Modern generals still cite Arsuf as proof that perfect execution can shatter overwhelming odds. But they also study it as a warning. A victory can be absolute on the field and still hollow in its long-term consequences. Richard the Lionheart carved his name into history that day, demonstrating a level of battlefield brilliance almost unmatched in the medieval world. But as the sun set on the plain of Arsuf and the Crusaders marched on, battered but triumphant, the truth followed quietly behind them. The battle had been won with breathtaking skill, yet the war for Jerusalem was already slipping beyond their grasp. In the end, Arsuf was not just a turning point in a single campaign. It was a reminder that even the greatest warriors cannot escape the weight of history, nor the limits of the world they fight to change.